Shalom, I'm Rabbi Michael Panitz, the Rabbi of Temple Israel of Norfolk, Virginia, and I'm speaking to you from the pulpit of my synagogue. I'm giving a personal message today on the occasion of the yahrzeit, the anniversary of the passing of my grandfather, Robert Allentuck, of blessed memory. And my message is entitled, Strong Roots. Today is the 31st yahrzeit of my maternal grandfather, Robert Allentuck, Reuven Isser ben Yaakov Halevi Behen Yerachel. When I arrived at Temple Israel and took up my service to our congregation 30 years ago, I was in the midst of the 11 months of saying Kaddish, the mourner's prayer in his memory. He was a grandfather to me, not a father. Why did I say Kaddish for him for the full 11 months, rather than the 30 days as mandated by Jewish law? Two reasons. First, he asked me to. And second, even if he had not, I just knew that it was what I needed to do. He asked me to, quote, be his Kaddish, as they said back in those days, at some point when he was about 75, nearly 2 decades before he died, at age 94. I well remember the occasion, a long walk with him on a section of Route 6, upstate New York, heading east towards Putnam County. A section of the highway that had just been built but not yet open to vehicular traffic. Naturally, it was part of our territory, just begging for us to explore it on foot while that could still be done. Some context. Long walks in the countryside were an important part of the rural half of our relationship. We had a rural regimen together, and we also had an urban one. They were each cherished, but quite different from each other. The rural part of our time was in the hamlet of Shrub Oak, an hour north of New York City, where my grandparents built a tiny bungalow, the last house halfway up the mountainside of Piano Mountain. They went there every summer and enjoyed a season of simple rustic living. I spent summers there until I was old enough to go off to sleepaway camp, the Jewish Camp Ramah in upstate New York. When I was old enough for camp, I still spent the shoulders of the summer at Shrub Oak. I continued going there when courting Sheila and as a young married. My grandmother would be slightly scandalized if ever I proposed to take Sheila out for pizza or for coffee. After all, wasn't I there for a rest? And wasn't my grandmother in charge of all of our meals and our comfort? Life was elemental there. Whatever we were doing, we consecrated the half hour of sunset and twilight to setting up lawn chairs and watching the sun go down over the hills, bracketing the Hudson Valley. When my father would spend Shabbat there, he would recite his morning prayers wrapped in his talit, sitting in a long chair among the oaks. Thoreau had his Walden Pond, where he wrote that the sound of his neighbor's cowbell was more spiritual than all the church bells of Boston. Yes, Thoreau had his Walden, and we had our Shrub Oak. In that setting, Papa Robert and I walked everywhere. A day was not complete without one of our walks. We walked around the lake. We walked down to the other end of the hamlet to see the pasture where the horses of the local magnate lived. We walked for pleasure, my grandfather telling me the names of different trees in Russian. I still remember Biroza is birch. On Sunday mornings, we walked into quote-unquote town to buy a newspaper. If Shrub Oak with its one street, its general store, cum post office, and its library could be dignified by being called town. We frequently walked up the steep path leading to the top of the local mountain. Ours was the last house before the road gave way to the mountain trail. Papa would carry his easel, I would carry his paint box. He would set up on the boulders at the summit and paint his vistas of the mountains in the mid-Hudson region. In season, I would collect blueberries in glass jars for my grandmother to use in her baking, muffins and cakes, and her cooking. At other times, I would try to identify the rocks, trees, ferns, flowers, and even the lichen, using the nature guidebooks my grandfather would buy me during our frequent visits to the American Museum of Natural History. And so on one of our walks, Papa said to me that he had a daughter and he had a son, but he felt that his son's life would not permit the daily recitation of Kaddish after Papa's demise. He said that his daughter would say Kaddish, and he appreciated that. He supported her professional advancement, and he was happy to see women achieve a higher status in the synagogue. But he felt that having a male descendant recite Kaddish would be a boon to his spirit. I myself was a staunch egalitarian in those years in matters of gender equality in Jewish ritual settings, but I chose not to challenge my Papa's request. It was his extinction that he was reckoning with, and I was not going to intrude into that sanctuary with my own ideological agenda. Part of the reason for my wish to do whatever I could to give ease to my grandfather's spirit was the connection cultivated throughout the year, the urban connection lasting from autumn through spring. My mother's parents were a steady presence in my life as I was growing up. My older brother, Raphael, and I spent every other weekend with my grandparents in their brownstone apartment in the Bronx. Jonathan, the oldest brother, had the alternate weekend there by himself. Their home from 1939 to 1969 was in a building long since lost to fire, 1254 Grant Avenue. It was just off the Grand Concourse, in its day an elegant Bronx boulevard. That apartment building was in a typical middle-class Jewish neighborhood from the generation of our immigrant ancestors, gracious in some details, such as a nicely appointed foyer for the apartment building, but certainly not lavish. Life there was not like what I knew from where my parents lived. Taking me to the kosher butcher, the bakery, all the stops on the errands that my grandfather would run for my grandmother. He would show me off to every lilting Yiddish accented English speaker in his circle. This was his village, right in the middle of a metropolis. Venturing further afield, we would take the subway into Manhattan or Coney Island. He would have me go under the turnstile to save the dime on the subway token. At one point, I felt that I was too old for that, but I respected that he was a working man without extra dimes to throw around. After decades of scrambling to support himself as a recent immigrant, my grandfather achieved a modicum of comfort as a dental technician. He worked with a circle of Jewish dentists in the Bronx, fabricating dentures and plates for their patients. Working as a dental technician allowed him to channel artistic energies that had always animated him. Finally, he had the freedom to pursue his lifelong dream and study sculpture and painting. He studied art at the New School in New York and devoted himself full-time to his art during the years of his retirement. But even when times were tight, there was always money for Hebrew and Jewish studies lessons for their children. My grandparents' daughter Esther, my mother, had a weekly lesson with her tutor, Mar Perach, from grade school all the way up through high school. Those lessons were substantive and deep, preparing her for admission at age 16 to the Teachers Institute of the Jewish Theological Seminary, where she was to meet my father. There was always money for culture. When they had weathered the worst of the Great Depression, my grandparents bought an upright piano so that Esther could have lessons. That piano was ultimately the first one that I played. In my generation, Papa took me to the New York Philharmonic for my first concert. I still remember we heard Beethoven's Fourth Symphony. For me, the first time ever hearing that wonderful piece. Papa took me to the Museum of Modern Art, showing me what was distinctive about the brushstrokes and the physicality of Cézanne's paintings. I could tell it was a favorite of his because it influenced his own painting style. And there was always money for charity. My visits spanned Shabbat, and my memory of Shabbat at my grandparents' will accompany me as long as I have memory. My grandmother created these delicious repasts out of a tiny kitchen we ate in the breakfast nook. There was a hook on the wall near the table, and a blue and white Jewish National Fund charity can hanging from the hook. Just before sundown, my grandmother would recite the blessing over the Shabbat candles. My grandfather would empty the change in his pockets into the JNF tzedakah can. Shabbat was a time when Jewish culture and world culture merged effortlessly at my grandparents' home. Kiddush, motzi, and meal, and after the meal I would browse their bookshelves to find reading for the evening, perhaps a short story by O. Henry or de Maupassant, or one of their beloved Russian masters. They fled persecution and the army of the Tsar, but never gave up their love of Russian culture. They themselves read their Chekhov and Turgenev and Dostoevsky and Tolstoy in the original, and sometimes in Hebrew or Yiddish translations. But there were English translations too in the shelves, and I enjoyed reading that literature specifically in their home. A final reminiscence for now. Maybe next year, next yard site, I'll be eager to share more. When my grandfather lay dying in the Jewish nursing home in New Rochelle, New York, he asked me to do one more thing for him. He took my hand and said, "Michael, I'm dying. Make sure they let me go in peace." I squeezed his hand. I promised to see that his wishes would be respected. I went to the nurse's station, confirmed the DNR they had on file, and came back to kiss my grandfather. He did indeed go in peace, after having lived a full and meaningful life of 94 years. His memory certainly endures in my life as a blessing. Amen.